track.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Before I introduce our speaker today, I just want to remind you of two other events we have this week. Tomorrow at noon, in the same room, we'll be hosting Ed Weber, who is the Duboc Professor of Political Science from Oregon State University. He'll be talking about the wicked policy problems associated with climate change, fish, and energy here in the Northwest. And then on Thursday, together with the Hoops Tax Institute, we're going to be hosting a debate and roundtable discussion about the carbon tax initiative here in Washington. And that will be held at 2 p.m. in the Cub Auditorium. We have a terrific panel of people who are both in favor and against the carbon tax initiative. 2 p.m. in the Cub Auditorium here on campus, and then also in the evening at 7 p.m. up on the WSU campus if you happen to be up in Spokane and would like to catch it there. Today, however, we're going to have a very interesting conversation with Dr. Annemarie Walter. She's going to be talking a little bit about negative campaigning, which is clearly very topical given the state of our current presidential politics right now. Dr. Walter is the Marie Curie and Nottingham Research Fellow in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham. She graduated with her degree in political science from Leiden University and earned her PhD at Amsterdam University. Her research interests include campaigns and elections, political communication, political parties and party systems, party strategy and electoral behavior, and she has written extensively about negative campaigning in Western Europe and its consequences. Hopefully she'll be able to give us a little comparative perspective about what's happening in our campaign right now. Join me now in welcoming Dr. Annemarie Walter.
So thank you very much all for coming today. I will talk a little bit about my research that I did during my dissertation and also more recent research that focuses more on the UK, since I'm now also working at a British university. We all see negative campaigning around us at this time of the year in the election campaign, and I will make a comparison how this basically looks, what type of parties use negative campaigning, and what effects are there outside of the United States. So first, before showing some examples of negative campaigning in the British context, let's define negative campaigning. Negative campaigning is also, in the literature, there's a conceptual debate about what is negative campaigning, but most empirical scholars tend to say that negative campaigning is just all criticism towards the political opponent, regardless its content. So this can be like civil, uncivil statements. It can be about the issues, the traits, the values of the political candidate. And negative campaigning is used with the aim of diminishing the positive feelings that voters might have for the political opponent, and with this goal basically to diminish the electoral attractiveness of the political opponent for voters. It stands in contrast to positive campaigning, and positive campaigning is then all self-praise of political candidates. Again, this can be about traits, values, issues. So regardless of the content, if it's self-praise, it's positive campaigning, and it has its goal to increase the own electoral attractiveness. And most of the time, people link positive campaigning is seen as more aimed at the already party adherents, people that are already supporting a political party or thinking about supporting a specific candidate. And negative campaigning is more aimed at undecided voters or voters of the political opponent. So why is it interesting to study negative campaigning outside of the United States? Because most research is about the United States, and of course the United States has a really particular political system. It's a two-party system, it's a presidential system, and it cannot be compared in many ways to other countries. So the question is then, to what extent can theory basically travel abroad? And it is interesting especially to make a comparative study on negative campaigning, because sometimes it is seen as an American phenomenon, negative campaigning. In Europe, when we talk about professionalization of election campaigns, some people see negative campaigning as an import product from the US. So with US political consultants and other more professional strategies came negative campaigning, according to some people. So, but also if we look at why certain campaigns are maybe more negative than others, to find out if there are systemic factors that maybe stimulate the use of negative campaigning, we need comparative research. And there is also not so much known about the effects of negative campaigning. So in general, voters are the same. However, the political system might basically affect the effects of negative campaigning. Yeah. So this is more from an academic perspective, and then there's also the concerns that are sometimes mentioned in the media that negative campaigning would diminish political trust, it would affect turnout, and therefore it undermines the legitimacy of our democracy. So before I talk about negative campaigning, some more general information to make a comparison between election campaigns in Western Europe, which is mainly my focus, and the US. First of all, election campaigns are much shorter in length. So here there's basically a permanent campaign, 2 years, they are really going for it. In Europe, it depends on the country. Maybe they run, most of the time it's from dissolution of parliament until election day, but the real focus of the campaign is 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the country. So it's much shorter. And then the campaigns are often perceived, I think from an American perspective, they would be perceived as less professional. And this is a consequence of all kinds of regulations that exist. One of them is the finance rules, basically. Political parties are much more limited than in the US in acquiring external funding. And therefore, they also have less money, basically, to run a more professional campaign, to hire political consultants, to hire people making their advertisement, and to buy advertisement time. And they have often also more restrictive rules in the opportunities political parties have in purchasing advertisement time. So what I know from the US is that approximately 50% of the campaign budget is spent on advertisement, and a lot of television ads basically dominate the campaign. Now in Western Europe this is different. So my research mainly focuses on the United Kingdom, Germany, and the Netherlands. And there, for instance, in the United Kingdom, to buy advertisement time, this is not possible. In Germany, this can only happen on the commercial broadcast channels, and in the Netherlands, it can happen on both. It's more recent development. What they do in those countries, when they don't have the opportunity to buy advertisement time, the government allocates them time slots to air ads. And this, of course, also affects how they run a campaign, because it limits targeting to voters, because they have to take the time slot that has been assigned to them, and this makes it more less dynamic also. So, and then it depends on how rich a political party is, whether they can buy advertisement time. So the bigger parties tend to do this more often than the smaller ones. So they are basically disadvantaged in the system, and the allocated time from government is also on the basis of size in parliament. And then, the importance of television advertisement also differs. Here is much more important, and on the basis of the opportunities political parties have, and this depends on the country, but often they also will run a lot of negative ads in a different way. So they do radio ads, YouTube ads, print advertisements, and especially in the Netherlands, advertisement on television is quite limited in how many people see this, and they run much more their campaign through the uncontrolled media, so television debates, and they try to generate more media attention. So here's some examples from the British context. So this is the 2010 general election. It's an ad from the Labour Party. Here we can see David Cameron, Boris Johnson are being portrayed as basically aliens. This is 1997. Basically Tony Blair with eyes of a devil.
More taxes.
More taxes.
More borrowing.
More borrowing.
More debt.
More debt.
conservative ad from the Scottish Nationalist Party, basically holding Ed Miliband as a puppet. So if you would vote for Labour Party, you would basically vote for the SNP, is the underlying suggestion. And then the last one.
There are three sides to this coin. I asked you at home to decide whether this is what protection looks like. 1 million people waited last year in A&E for more than 4 hours. We've got ambulances queuing outside our accident and emergency units. We're missing the targets for cancer treatment for the first time ever. And to add to that, we had a tent erected in a hospital car park to treat people in 2015 in our United Kingdom. I do not believe that is protecting the NHS, and his spending plans for the next Parliament are even more dangerous. You failed the British people. You've broken your bond of trust on the National Health Service. They believed you. They believed you. They believe you're another kind of conservative, and it's gone backwards on your watch, and they won't trust you again.
So during my dissertation a couple years ago, one of the questions that we had was basically, does negative campaigning exist in Western Europe? Really simplistic to map basically the phenomenon, because there's not so much research out there and people talk about it, but what are basically the levels of negative campaigning? What we did to make a comparison with the US, I basically studied all the party election broadcasts. This is basically the free allocated advertisement time that they got, and we made a comparison, and we used the same coding scheme as John Gear. So what you can see is the it works. I don't know if you can see it, but anyway, the red line is the data from American research from John Gear, and then with the same method you can see the other countries. So the red line is the US, then the blue line is the United Kingdom, so that's the closest in level of negative campaigning in television ads as the US. Then you can see the Netherlands. This is the orange-yellow line, and the lowest level of negative campaigning we saw in Germany. So what you can see is that the level of negative campaigning in television ads from the UK really approaches the US. And we see fluctuation over time, but we do not see an increase, at least not from 1980. So I did not go further back because of how data has been kept in most European countries. But we could not see a rise, because often we think that with increasing professionalization and also commercialization of television that we get an increase in negative campaigning. We could not see this. And we saw interesting country differences, and one of my hypotheses was that maybe the party system is a factor that affects the level of negative campaigning, which I will elaborate more on later. Then they thought, what is the content of those ads? Is it mainly negative campaigning in the sense that you attack your opponent on his traits, or is it about issues? Because often when people think that negative campaigning is a negative development, they think that it makes campaigns less informative. So again, the red line is United States, John Gear's data, and the other lines are from the European countries. And what we can see is that in Europe, it's most of the time it's even less than 10% of the ads that basically talk about the opponent's personal characteristics when he or she is being attacked. So my theory is that voters are the same, but the political system in which they reside affects basically the effects of negative campaigning, and then the characteristic that I think that matters the most is the party system. A party system matters because the party system determines the number of parties that basically exist, the type of parties that are present and how they compete. So, for instance, whether there are multiple left-wing parties, whether there is such a thing as an anti-establishment party present, and whether they have a way of competition that is more confrontational, or whether they aim more at consensus. And this matters, the party system, because it affects the cost and benefits of going negative and the analysis that political parties basically make. And parties, in my research, are seen as rational actors, so they really think about whether going negative would be beneficial for them. And in a multi-party system, this is more complicated, because parties tend to strive for votes for office and to implement policy. However, in a multi-party system, often after the election day, they have to govern together. So if you run a really aggressive campaign, this might limit your opportunities to work together. And also in multi-party systems, it's not necessarily the case that when you win the most votes, that you will also govern and implement policy. It can be the case that you are the winner after the election campaign, but the coalition is basically formed with the other parties. Yeah, so it is more complex balancing of objectives. And this affects the cost of negative campaigning. So generally in the literature, in the US literature, there's one cost that is really important around negative campaigning. This is the backlash effect. If you run a too negative campaign, that your voters might turn away from you because they see this as behavior that is not done. And in a multi-party system, you have then the extra cost of post-election bargaining. Will your enemy, if your enemy is going to win after the election campaign, will they still work with you afterwards if you have attacked them too fiercely? And what you can see in my previous research is that the type of parties that run a negative campaign in Western Europe are often parties that are, like in the US, in opposition, losing in the polls, but also parties that have limited coalition potential. So therefore they are more willing to take those potential risks of not participating due to their aggressive campaigning in the coalition, and they tend to run a more negative campaign. However, it's not only about the cost, it's also about the rewards, and the rewards of negative campaigning are less certain in a multi-party system because of the fact there are alternatives. So in the US, when you're a Republican voter and maybe you are turned off due to campaigning from the Democrats, where do you go? So most of the time, if you're really turned off due to because of negative campaigning, maybe you don't participate anymore in the electoral process. So you can stay at home. But in a multi-party system, depending on the type of multi-party system, there are numerous alternatives. So there's always another left-wing party, or even if you are so dissatisfied with politicians in general, there might be an anti-establishment party which you can vote for. So the question is, do political parties really gain by going negative in a multi-party system? And what negative campaigning basically can do is, in multi-party system, voters often identify with more than one party, and they rank the number of parties that they have in their choice set. And the ranking can be affected or altered by all kinds of factors, and one of them is negative campaigning. So it basically looks like this. For instance, in the UK, you have in most districts you have the Labours, the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats, UKIP, which is an anti-establishment party, and the Green Party. And then if you live in Scotland, you have also the Scottish Nationalist Party, or Plaid Cymru in Wales. And if one of them was your first preferred choice, and you turn away, there might be an alternative. So you might go from Labour to the Green Party, or from the Conservatives to UKIP. And my more recent research is about the effects of negative campaigning, and I'm studying it at the moment mainly in the UK, but I will replicate this also in other European countries. And we look whether this is the case in the UK. And I present the UK also as a multi-party system case, although it was most in the past was seen as a 2.5 party system. You can see that increasingly other parties are becoming important in the system, and also in the UK we know that 50% of the electorate identifies with more than one party. So they, between elections, they can potentially switch between those parties in their choice set. So what we did is we asked basically voters to evaluate the campaign, the last election campaign in 2015, to say to what extent the campaign was focused on criticizing policies, personalities of other parties, or whether they focused on putting forward their own policies and personalities. So we indirectly ask the tone, but we don't use the word negative or positive because this tends to overestimate negativity. So this is a perception approach, because I think it's important to look at the perception because we're looking at effects, because a campaign might be negative, but if it's not perceived as negative by the voter, I think it's not such a good indicator to measure effects. So here you can see an aggregate graph of the data over time, and you can see fluctuations basically per campaign day in those 6 weeks until election day. And what you can see is that the most negative campaign, according to the voters, was run by UKIP and the Conservative Party. And what is interesting, I think, in the findings of my study is that when we look at the effects, that at least in multi-party systems, the effects of negative campaigning, they seem to be different. In the sense that what is similar is that we also find the backlash effect. We mainly find that parties that are perceived as really running a negative campaign, that they basically it depresses the party preference voters have for that party. The party becomes less likable. And also the question is then if the first preferred party is not so likable anymore because of the fact that it ran a negative campaign, where do the voters go to? And what we see is that for the voters that have more than one preference, they tend to go to their second preferred preference. So we see basically this switch in their electoral choice set. So and other parties basically gain by, they can basically gain by somebody else running a negative campaign. So by running a negative campaign, you can help other political opponents. And then the question, of course, is this is the individual level. How does this translate to the aggregate level? Because it might wash out. So does it affect also party vote share? And what we find is that those switches between between parties due to negative campaigning, that this can be like 5% of the party vote share. So this it fluctuates, but it can be substantial. So it matters. And we also see then on the aggregate level that when a party goes negative, not only it diminishes its own party vote share, those other parties, almost all parties benefit a little bit, but the main electoral competitor benefits basically the most. So if in the Conservatives, for instance, go negative, UKIP is the party that gains the most of the votes. And then also we looked at side effects because of this whole debate, the negative campaigning, regardless whether it might not be beneficial for parties maybe to use this strategy. Does it have any type of effects that is maybe not, whether this is undermining our democracy? So we looked at political trust. So political trust, of course, is an important concept because when voters have trust in the government, in the political actors, it also helps to, voters tend to support policy, even if it's policy that they don't like or made by a political party that they don't support, when they have a lot of political trust. So it's important for legislation and policies. However, we find also that political trust diminishes when voters are continuously exposed to negativity. And in particularly also undecided voters and voters that do not identify with the government as their main political authority. So these are voters that have a conflicting identity. So they, for instance, see the Scottish government as their main political authority instead of the UK government. And then the question is, does this also affect turnout? And we don't find this, and I think this is because of the fact that we have these anti-establishment parties in the system. So when voters are disappointed, maybe due to negative campaigning in the political candidates they wanted to go through, and they also don't see an alternative, they can still vote for this anti-establishment party, which most of the time channels the discontent back into the party system. So the conclusion of my recent research is that in a multi-party system, negative campaigning might be more hurtful than helpful for a political party engagement. However, of course, we have to replicate this in other settings than the UK. So if you want to know more about negative campaigning in other settings, I have together with Alessandro and I, we have an edited volume with ECPR Press, and I think it's quite interesting as far as there are scholars that are working on negative campaigning in another context. We all have them in there, also a couple US scholars, and you can see how does this work, for instance, in a referendum setting, what do we find in Brazil. So I think it's an interesting book to read.
Okay, so we have about half an hour or so for questions and answers. Maybe I'll start. You indicated that that when a party chooses to go negative in a multi-party system, that they often lose, and the next competitor, the next closest competitor, gains. And which makes sense. You know, if the Conservatives attack the Labour Party, then UKIP's going to gain from that, I guess. Does it matter who they're attacking? What if the Conservatives attack UKIP?
Okay, so one of the limitations of my research at the moment still is that we do not know the perception of the voter on whom they attack. But theoretically, you would think that this, of course, matters.
Yeah.
So in the future, I hope to do some experiments, and then in the way that we look whether the attack is basically aimed at the other side of the political spectrum, or whether it's aimed at within. So often what you see in multi-party systems is that they have blocks, and then if you attack a party in the same party family, yeah. So because we know from more illustrative. I know from more illustrative examples in the Netherlands by talking to campaign managers that they sometimes avoid attacking their neighboring or ideological partner, basically. Not only because of the fact they might maybe want to form a coalition afterwards of the election campaign, but also because the voters consider it not done to attack basically the ideological neighbor. And I know from the Netherlands also that might be interesting that the Christian parties don't attack. They're more reluctant to attack in general, and especially not other Christian parties, because the voters see this as unchristian behavior. So that is one of the reasons that the campaign managers gave for not engaging so much in negative campaigning.
The definitions you attached as positive and negative, and it seems like you, if I'm reading it correctly, you lump a candidate who's trying to differentiate on a policy basis with their opponent as negative campaigning. And I guess as a voter, I would not see that as negative, nor would I see it as an attack. I would see it in the same way you might differentiate a product. Why didn't you find some middle ground?
So first of all, this is the most dominant definition in the literature. So if you want to make a comparison, but it also, when you look at voters, I think you will find that there is not one common definition. So it differs between voters what they see as negative. So we have also research, for instance, that voters find when their own party goes negative, regardless what the content is, they don't perceive it as negative. Yeah, so it would be difficult to do this, but I know, like in the Netherlands, also the campaign managers don't think that they run a negative campaign, and in the Netherlands, they think, for instance, that campaign managers only run. They think they run a negative campaign only when they attack the private sphere of a politician. So when it has really nothing to do with the office. So, but it is quite difficult when you do quantitative research to have a definition that is measurable and can be applied by also many different coders, for instance. Because when it comes down to perception, so the only differentiation that I basically did is what I showed is like, okay, is it aimed at issues or is it aimed at traits? And we don't differentiate like further. Because you also have this thing like if it's civil or uncivil, but often those things are in the perception of the one that looks at the advertisement.
So by nature of debate, would be a negative campaign activity.
Well, politics is by
Even
nature
even
about conflict.
Yeah, even a debate in its best form would be negative.
Yeah. So in general, I also don't think that there's something wrong with negative campaigning because it is part of the political process.
Yeah, this is so fascinating, and particularly for Americans who haven't looked at European countries. And in my comparative politics class, public policy class, students just are blown away that, you know, there's all these rules. You have limited campaign season, you can't buy TV ads, political parties are, you know, it's a whole different ballgame. And so this leads me to a causality question and your theory. Because to me, it's not about political party system at all. And I think you really need to tease this out a bit more. It's either an institutional argument or it's a cultural argument. You know, why are these people campaigning? Why are the voters turning against negative campaigning? Well, to me, it's sort of like, okay, you showed us all the rules differences. Is that there's all these rules differences? There's not a culture of campaigning. There's not a culture of advertising, of TV advertising. There are rules that limit it, and then that's why people, you know, in this country, we're just so used to it. It's like standard, it's SOP, standard operating procedures. It's not shocking. It's almost we expect people to do negative, nasty campaigning. But I think that, you know, I think you're going to have to factor that in. I think you can't just go away, you know, just say, oh, we're going to treat these equally. I think you're going to have to bring an institutional variable that might be combined with the cultural aspect, and it would be really interesting to ask people how they see advertising in general, if they think it's a major type of thing. Anyway, I wanted to put that on the table, and I think that is a problem with your theory, but I'd just like to hear what you react
So
to.
I think in general, when you do comparative research, it's problematic that you compare countries, because to what extent are they the same and can they be compared? So one of the limitations that I am aware of is also I only studied 3 countries. So if you really want to establish that it is the party system, then you would have to have a large number of countries. You would have to make a design that you also look at other institutional factors to really see if this is the causal mechanism. However, theoretically, on the basis of theory, I would say that it is the party system due to the fact that it affects the type of government. And it also affects, therefore, the type of the political culture. Because if you see when there is, especially in countries when there are most of the time there is a coalition government instead of a majoritarian government, you have a consensus culture. Because they know they have to work together, and therefore.
The past 8 years. I mean,
Is
that's
it
very recent. That's not even coalition governments only started very recently.
Yeah, in the UK. But,
Yeah.
but if you look at other countries, you get a more, like what Leipart describes, a more consensus democracy. It's more
Yes.
about consensus, and therefore people tend to engage in a less adversarial way with one another. The one study that I did with Travis about New Zealand, there was an attempt to filter this out. In New Zealand, you had party system change. So therefore, we look basically at the way parties were competing with one another before the party system changed and afterwards. And then we saw a difference in the level of negative campaigning. So therefore, we tied it to party system
But are you
change.
controlling for these cultural explanations? I don't see that. I just see you're going party system and you say, voila, party system.
Yeah, but
because to
if
me, I
you-
just see, coming from an American perspective, we don't put into question that. It's not a negative. I don't know the literature. I don't know if studies show are Americans really upset by negative campaigning. It just seems, I don't know. Didn't you have a study showing that it's not even something we care about that much, negative campaigning?
It depends on how you word the question.
Yeah.
Whether
okay,
we're upset
okay.
or not.
Anyway, it just seems I just think you need to. I don't know. Do you see what I mean? It's like
No, I
because in
understand.
New Zealand, campaigning. It's just so because of the institutional landscape and the rules of the game for campaigning are just so different. It seems like that's kind of an easy, most similar system setup that you have that you could. I don't know, but maybe I'm missing. I might be.
It's just due to the limited number of countries. I think that I cannot do this, but also political culture is in general a really difficult thing to quantify.
Yeah, it is very different.
In the field of if you have a quantitative approach. how to quantify this.
But you could put in, you could develop a variable that actually codes how long, the level of rules again that block campaigns or something like that, or something. Anyway, that just seems kind of like.
Okay. So thank you very much for the comments. But
Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry.
But it's on the basis of if I would have more money, more countries,
Yeah.
then this would definitely be one of the factors that we could use to
really
try to find also
But it's
empirically
fantastic research, and you know what people say when people are critical of something.
It
means it's really good research.
It's fine.
For those of you who aren't familiar with
Would you describe more of
Question.
the change you mentioned in New Zealand when they changed party systems, and what was the effect on negative?
Yeah, so because they went from a more majoritarian to basically a proportional system. So we saw the party system change in the sense that it became more a multi-party system. So there become more parties, and the way of competition becomes also different according to my theory, because they form coalition governments. So you can see then when it's more like a multi-party system, that the level of negative campaigning is lower than when it's more like a two-party system.
And so that was borne out in New Zealand?
Yeah, so they had party system change. So, but it was one way to try to see if it was really the party system or not.
Yes.
But you have to do it with basically what reality gives you in a type of natural experiment, because of the limited countries that I have in my study.
Look at other factors in terms of what drives negative campaigning. For instance, I'm thinking things like the gender of the candidates, or race of the candidates, or whether in parties, out parties, all sorts of things like that.
So I have one study on. I tried to do it, but also again, you have to do it with reality gives you. So I have 23 elections I had during my dissertation, and I think out of those 23. 7 or 9 parties had a female party leader. Yeah, so you are limited with the number of opportunities, and I tried to model whether it mattered whether the party had a female party leader or not. First of all, of course, you have this limitation in Europe that is more about the parties than the political candidates. So the question is, to what extent do the political candidates really affect the campaign style, or is this determined by the political party? And I think this is more depends also on the type of political party, to what extent a political candidate can influence the campaign style. But what I did with my model is that I basically found that there was no gender effect. And then the question is why. The only thing I found was a Thatcher effect in the UK, that when Margaret Thatcher was basically in power, that she would run a more negative campaign even than the male opponents. And with race, I don't think there's so much diversity also again in race. And I did it, of course, also at the national level. You can maybe in the UK and Germany you could look at a local level of campaigning. Find more candidates, but I also don't know to what extent there's difference in race. They tend to be white. So
did you look at parties in power, parties out of power?
Yeah. That's most of the time the parties that are in opposition, so out of power, they run a more negative campaign.
Yeah.
I was actually curious about the nature of the parties themselves. So in the UK, you've got Conservatives and Labour as kind of the big ones, along with the Lib Dems. But then you've got quote-unquote more outsider parties like UKIP. And I was wondering if there was any consideration of the prevalence of quote-unquote outsider parties or smaller factions influencing the level of negativity in the campaigns, and whether they influenced like the more mainstream parties to go more negative based on their presence.
Okay, so first of all, what you see is that anti-establishment parties, they go more negative because it's in their nature. Yeah? What we saw in the Netherlands is that in campaigns that the more smaller anti-establishment parties, they're often more right-wing than left-wing, that when they participate, that also the overall level of negative campaigning in that campaign is higher. I do not know of any work, and I also did not do this, that I looked at whether they adopted strategies from minor parties. So I did not look at them to what extent they adopt. But also political color matters. We don't have a theory for this. Like for instance, in the U.S., they tend to find, I think, that the Republicans run a more negative ads than Democrats. What you can find in England is also that conservative campaigns, they tend to be more negative than Labour campaigns. So in general, what we see in the literature, I also know from Danish studies, for instance, that the right-wing parties, they tend to run more negative campaigns. Regardless, even when you control for all the other factors. And we don't really have an explanation for this, why this would be the case.
So, I'm curious, I think it's very fascinating that when one ad, let's say the UKIP party runs negative ads, that it aids their ideological cousins, the conservatives. Are there any case studies or examples you can think of where the kind of cousin party, like the Conservative Party, might be embroiled in a scandal where their numbers are very low? Will it always aid them if they're having problems? If the other campaign runs a negative ad, will it always hurt that campaign? Is there some conditions where it's not always the case?
That we don't know, because basically the study that I do is the first study on effects outside of the a two-party system. So we need more research to use to look at specific conditions, whether it's always the case, because it's one election campaign.
Sure. So how has your study incorporated party loyalty? You know, two-party system, there aren't very many options, so I think that it creates stronger party loyalty. So even if you're not fond of the Democratic candidate, you're going to vote Democrat because you don't want the Republicans to assert or govern. And in a multi-party system, you have the option to vote for a party which aligns similarly. So how does your research incorporate?
Yeah, so we control for our party identification and strength of party identification. That's the only way that I think you can control for this. So, like if people have identify stronger with one political party, they also, their choice set often is only a single party, or when they identify with two parties, it also matters what the distance is in the choices between the parties. So if you have a really strong identification for the first one and the distance for the second one is larger, then to switch from the first to the second preferred party, more has to happen for that than when you equally identify with two parties. So we measure we use a 10-point scale where we measure, we basically ask for every political party what's the likelihood that you would vote for this. And then we can also measure basically the distance, not only what is the first preference, what's the second preference, but how large the distance is. So that is how we try to take this into account.
One question regarding those minor parties, like because you have the Conservative Labour, do those other parties, do they still get to debate and advertise, or is it similar to the U.S. system? You know much about it?
No, they get to participate in debates and advertise. Like when it comes to government allocated free advertisement, most of the time this is on the basis, in European countries, on the basis of party size. So when the party is bigger in parliament, they tend to get more advertisement slots than the smaller parties. However, they still get advertisement slots, and if they want, depending on the country, they could also buy, of course, advertisement slots. With election debates in the UK, I think they sometimes they do. It depends a little bit on what kind of debate tradition the country has. So election debates, I think in the UK, they are quite recent, only since 2010, and sometimes I think in 2010, I think they did the 3 leaders, and now they did maybe I think it was maybe 5. In the Netherlands, we have much longer. Germany is the same. We have inspired by the US around the same time. We have a tradition of election debates, and often it depends on what is seen as relevant. The Netherlands is, for instance, an extreme multi-party system, so we have in parliament 11 or 12 parties, and do you want to see a debate with 12 party leaders? Sometimes this happens when it's really fragmented during the election campaign, but often, basically, the broadcast channel just determines what type of debate they want to see. So sometimes we do American style, and we try to invite the 2 main competitors, if this is possible, and they use election polls as a basis for this. Sometimes we do what they call in Germany Elefantenrunde. So we take basically the main political leaders, In the Netherlands, you also have something that's called the Smurfendebat. I don't know, like those, you know, those blue, yeah. Those, and then people are, yeah, the small parties are sometimes offended by this because that's basically all the parties that we did not invite for the main debate. So first we have like a television debate with the main party leaders, so the main 5, for instance, depending on the election polls, and then we invite the other 5. Sometimes it happens that in the Netherlands, because it's such an extreme multi-party system, it's the most extreme form of PR, that some parties have only 1 or 2 seats in parliament, and then they don't get invited. Sometimes they go to court to try to make the broadcast channel incorporate them. For instance, I think the Party of Animals did this one time. So we also have a party that represents animal rights. It's about extreme representation.
Not a party composed of animals.
So I think it has 2 to 3 seats in parliament. So yeah. So this is how basically election debates look, and because of the fact that advertisement is in a lot of countries less important or less used, those election debates are really important because because of the it gets also the media coverage that it gets. Does it answer your question?
Yeah. So, I mean, according to the numbers you put up there, the U.S. and the U.K. look pretty similar in terms of negativity in advertising campaigns, but are there qualitative differences between the types of attacks, so that what those negative ads look like across those 2 countries?
Okay, first of all, I think especially the time slots that they get for free, they are often 5 minutes or 3 to 5 minute time slots. So they are television ads. They tend to be longer. When they buy airtime, they could become more similar to the US. They are often really short time slots. So, but when what they do often in US research is they classify the whole ad as negative. Yeah, I use Geer's coding scheme, and he looks for appeals. If you classify the whole ad as negative, this is less likely to happen because a 5 minute ad can just completely be negative. Yeah, so it's more than a comparative. It's difficult to be. Yeah, so I think this is one of the limitations of how it is measured. So that is one difference. Also, I think. But this is not on the basis of empirical research. My feeling would be that it's more civil negative campaigning in Western Europe than here in the US. Yeah, because especially, I think culturally certain statements which are made here would be considered much more severe. I don't think that the British tend to be still quite polite, although they say nasty things. Yeah, so it's more in an indirect way. In the Netherlands, we have a culture of consensus making. Yeah, so in Germany the same. So it is certain things I think might culturally be more difficult to say, but this is different. Yeah, but there is no research measuring. To my knowledge, there's no research on civil or incivility, basically, during election campaigns in Western Europe. So I have no empirical kind of basis to say this. So this is one of the differences, I think.
Time for one more question, please.
Right. Annemarie, you mentioned how different elements of American advertising campaigning has moved over to Europe. I'm just wondering how you see that developing over time. Do you think that European campaigns are going to become more like American ones? Adopting more of the procedures, more of this sort of glitzy, debatey style stuff that we see here, and more of the negative campaigns as well? Or do you think that the institutional constraints will stop that from happening?
Well, I think that countries really experiment with. So what you see, for instance, in the UK, they tend to hire political consultants from American political consultants. You don't see this, for instance, in the Netherlands. It has to do with money, but also because campaign managers often say, like, those practices, they are just not applicable. But I know we are highly inspired by the US, because most of the time, I know that most European parties send people during election campaigns here in the US to, for instance, the conventions, and they go on tours to look how the Americans do it. So it's really an inspiration for us. However,
That's depressing.
no, I think in general political consultants in Europe really respect the Americans because it's such a more advanced level of campaigning due to the fact there's so much money going into this, so many people work in this field. It's not comparable to what happens in Europe. So there is some research about professionalization, but again, this is often single case. It's more illustrative on, for instance, how people perceive the campaign as becoming more professional. So they would ask political consultants, "How did you see this campaign? Do you think there is a rise?" I think we adopt. It depends a little bit on the country. I think we adopt practices, but they don't. Yeah, but often they are adapted again to the setting, and some things that just don't work. But there's really like an Americanization type of wave. I don't know of any research that really would support this, but I know from illustrations from when you talk to campaign managers that they are inspired by what the Americans do.
Okay, so question. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at the example you gave of Ed Miliband being controlled by labor. That's both a personal attack and a policy critique in a way, right? We have those combined type of negative campaigning. Then you have, in some instances, where it's just personal negative campaigning, and then you have in some instances where it's just critical of policy negative campaigning. If you were able, because I know you weren't able to, but if you were able to separate these things out to policy critique versus candidate critique, do you feel like you would see the same type of effects in these parliamentary systems where maybe a personal critique would be more effective in driving voters away from that party, whereas a policy critique might actually shore up the party and cause more of a support? Do you think there might be that type of effect, or is negative?
So we have not done this yet. This is also one of the things that I intend to do. I think, of course, there will be a difference because similar, like I know from Dutch survey research that similar like the US, if you ask the type of attacks that people don't like, they tend to not like candidates. Basically, attacks that attack the traits of a candidate or the personal life. These type of attacks are less tolerated by voters than issue attacks. So I would expect that attacks towards the traits, and especially if it would involve maybe more private life, so traits that are not really linked to the office, that they would have the most severe reactions in general. And I think in terms of backlash, of course, the more private it becomes, the stronger the backlash effect. In the Netherlands, I think is quite not done to talk about the personal life of a politician because it's not related to the office. So I would expect severe backlash effects. And then, I don't know, the question, I don't think it would really affect the question how they would move within the choice set. I think the severity of the attack might maybe affect how quickly they would shift from one party to the other.
Okay. I was just thinking, you said you can't be negative for 5 minutes. You haven't listened to some of those candidates' selection cycle. Before I ask you, and joining me in thanking our guests, let me remind you again, tomorrow we have Ed Weber speaking about the policy problems connected to climate change, energy, and water in this region. And then on Thursday we have at 2 p.m. over in the Cub Auditorium, the debate on the carbon tax initiative. So I want to encourage you to come back to both those. Now, join me now in thanking our guests for a really informative, interesting conversation about negative campaigns.